It was the second week of November 1989, deep in the Appalachian hills of eastern Kentucky. It was a time of year when the vibrant autumn colors rot into shades of rust and brown, and the air takes on the sharp, metallic bite of approaching winter. In the small, isolated logging town of Oakhaven, life moved at the speed of the seasons. The sun dipped behind the jagged ridges by 5 o'clock, casting long, dark shadows that seemed to swallow the hollows whole. When the darkness fell here, it was absolute. It was a Friday, payday at the local timber mill. The air in town smelled heavily of fresh-cut pine, diesel exhaust, and wood smoke curling from stone chimneys. A group of 5 friends had planned a weekend retreat at a family hunting cabin perched near the very top of Blackwood Ridge. It was an annual tradition, meant to be a final celebration before the brutal winter snows made the winding, unpaved mountain roads completely impossible. The group was incredibly tight-knit, bound by the kind of loyalty that only exists in towns where everyone relies on each other. There was 27-year-old Thomas Vance, a foreman at the mill, known for his level head, callous hands, and quiet authority. Beside him was his wife, 25-year-old Eleanor, a beloved kindergarten teacher who had a habit of seeing the beauty in the mundane. She never went anywhere without her 35mm camera slung around her neck. Riding in the back of Thomas's dark green Ford pickup was David Corin, 26, a childhood friend and seasoned outdoorsman who knew the Kentucky woods better than he knew the streets of his own town. Following close behind in a second car, a dusted bay sedan, were 22-year-old Samuel Hayes and his fiancée, 23-year-old Clara Miller. They were young, loud, hopelessly in love, and currently planning a spring wedding that the whole town was invited to. At 6:45 p.m., the 2 vehicles pulled into the flickering neon glow of a Texaco station just outside the county line. The attendant working the register, an older man named Earl, remembered them vividly. They bought 2 thermoses of black coffee, 3 bags of ice, and a heavy bundle of kindling. They were happy. They were laughing. Samuel was playfully teasing David about the massive, heavy wool coat he insisted on wearing even inside the heated store. Before they walked out the glass doors, Eleanor raised her camera and snapped a candid photo of the boys standing by the gas pumps, their breath pluming in the freezing air. By 7:15 p.m., they were back on the road. Earl watched through the grease-smudged window as their red taillights faded into the heavy, creeping fog that had begun to snake its way down the side of Blackwood Ridge. That was the last time anyone saw the 5 of them alive. When Monday morning arrived, the piercing whistle of the timber mill signaled the start of the week. The heavy machines roared to life, but Thomas and David did not clock in. Across town at the elementary school, the bell rang, but Eleanor's classroom sat entirely empty, her students waiting in the hallway. In a town like Oakhaven, a mischief wasn't immediately a cause for widespread panic. The roads on the ridge were notoriously treacherous. A washed-out dirt path, a fallen tree, or a dead truck battery could easily strand a group for an extra day or 2. But by Monday evening, the weather turned violent. The temperature plummeted into the low 20s, bringing a vicious mix of sleet and freezing rain that coated the town in a sheet of ice. When repeated phone calls to the cabin's landline went completely unanswered, Thomas's father, Henry Vance, couldn't wait any longer. He grabbed a heavy flashlight, climbed into his 4-wheel drive Jeep, and began the dangerous, slipping crawl up the mountain. He reached the cabin just after dusk. The woods were dead silent, save for the sound of ice ticking against the bare branches. Both vehicles, the Ford pickup and Samuel's bay sedan, were parked neatly in the gravel driveway. The tires were intact. There were no flat tires, no shattered windows. But when Henry walked over and placed his bare hand on the hood of the Ford, his stomach dropped. The engine was ice cold. They hadn't been driven in days. When he stepped onto the wooden porch, the unease began to curdle into sheer terror. The heavy wooden front door of the cabin was wide open, creaking softly, almost rhythmically, as a freezing wind pushed it back and forth on its hinges. Lying on the floorboards just outside the threshold was a shattered kerosene lantern. The thick glass was broken into dozens of jagged pieces, its fuel soaked deep into the wood, leaving a strong, chemical stench in the cold air. Henry called out. No answer. Inside, the cabin was eerily, unnervingly still. It looked like a photograph of a moment that had been violently paused. In the stone hearth, the fire had long since burned down to a fine, white powdery ash. On the rustic wooden dining table sat a deck of playing cards, dealt perfectly into 5 hands. Half-empty mugs of coffee rested beside them, the liquid inside completely frozen solid. Eleanor's leather purse was still slung over the back of a wooden chair, but it was a cast-iron coat rack standing by the door that made Henry Vance realize something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. All 5 of their heavy winter coats were hanging there. Below them, lined up neatly against the baseboard, were their thick, insulated winter boots. Leaning against the wall was David's hunting rifle, fully loaded and completely untouched. Outside, the temperature was hovering at 19 degrees. The wind chill made it feel closer to 0. No one, absolutely no one, would have walked out into the pitch-black Kentucky night without their boots and coats. Not willingly. By midnight, the quiet town of Oakhaven was flooded with flashing red and blue lights. The county sheriff mobilized every available deputy on the roster. State police were called in. Highly trained search dogs were brought up the winding ridge. Dozens of local volunteers carrying high-powered flashlights and shotgun formed shoulder-to-shoulder grid lines, pushing deep into the dense, thorny brush surrounding the property. The searchers expected to find footprints in the heavy frost. They expected to find broken branches, dropped items, or a trail leading off into the woods. But the dogs paced in frustrated, confused circles around the front porch. They whined, sniffing the edge of the gravel driveway, before sitting down and refusing to move. The handlers tried to push them forward, but it was useless. The scent simply vanished. It was as if all 5 adults had stepped onto the driveway and evaporated into the freezing fog. The theories came quickly, born of logic and desperate, clinging hope. The first assumption was a sudden medical emergency. Perhaps one of them had gotten injured, a deep cut, a heart issue, and the others panicked, rushing out to find help in the dark, only to become hopelessly disoriented in the freezing fog. But the terrain on Blackwood Ridge was brutally rugged. It was heavily scarred with limestone sinkholes, hidden caves, and deep, rocky ravines. If they had wandered blindly into the dark in only their socks and indoor shoes, someone would have slipped. Someone would have fallen. But 5 full-grown adults don't vanish into a ravine without leaving a snapped branch, a disturbed patch of date, a scrap of fabric, or a cry for help. Then, as the days dragged on with no answers, the theories turned darker. Paranoia took root. Whispers spread through the diner booths and the aisles of the hardware store. People talked about illegal, violent moonshine operations hidden deep in the mountain hollows. They talked about ruthless poachers protecting their territory. Did the group hear a strange noise, step out onto the porch to look, and see something they weren't ever supposed to see? 3 agonizing weeks into the search, a local hunter tracking a white-tailed deer made a chilling discovery. Nearly 4 miles away from the cabin, in the exact opposite direction of the main road, he noticed a faint glint of silver in a frozen creek bed. He dug his gloved hands into the freezing mud and pulled it out. It was a camera, Eleanor's 35mm. Detectives rushed the frozen film to a specialized state lab, praying the moisture hadn't ruined the negatives. Miraculously, the film was salvaged. Investigators sat in a darkroom, watching as the images slowly developed. Most of the roll contained mundane, heartbreakingly happy memories. The drive up the mountain, the photo of Samuel and David laughing at the gas station, a picture of Clara dealing the deck of cards at the cabin table, bathed in the warm, yellow light of the lantern. But the final photograph on the roll was different. It was taken outside, in the pitch black of the night. The flash was harsh, illuminating a thick, blinding wall of fog and the rough, textured bark of a nearby pine tree. But in the upper right corner of the frame, barely visible in the dark, grainy shadows of the film, was a shape. It was blurred, metallic, and catching the artificial light of the flash. Detectives enhanced the photo. It was a distinctive, heavy steel grille of a large vehicle, parked deep in the woods where absolutely no paved roads existed. Despite this massive clue, the physical search yielded nothing else. The winter snows came heavy that year, burying Blackwood Ridge under 2 feet of suffocating white silence. The search tents were packed up. The tracking dogs were sent home. The helicopters were grounded due to low visibility. Months turned into years. The 1980s faded into the 90s, and then the new millennium. The story of the Blackwood Five became a dark, open wound in eastern Kentucky. It turned into a piece of Appalachian folklore. The family cabin on the ridge was abandoned. It slowly rotted, its roof eventually caving in under the weight of uncounted winters. The families of the missing aged. Bedrooms were kept exactly as they had been left that November weekend, gathering dust like quiet museums of grief. Some parents pass away, taking the agonizing torture of not knowing to their graves. Oakhaven learned to live with the scar, but a profound, quiet paranoia remained woven into the fabric of the town. People locked their doors earlier. Children were told never to wander near the tree line. They didn't trust the woods after dark anymore, because everyone in town knew the terrifying truth. Whatever had taken 5 healthy adults in the prime of their lives was still out there, and it was never caught. Then came the spring of 2024. 35 years after the disappearance, eastern Kentucky was hit by a series of unprecedented, violent thunderstorms. Flash floods tore through the mountain hollows, washing out ancient dirt roads, uprooting century-old trees, and triggering massive landslides across the county. A state geological survey team was dispatched to assess the structural integrity of a long-abandoned limestone quarry, located almost 8 miles from the ruins of the old Vance cabin. The quarry had been shut down in the late 1970s, deemed unprofitable, and simply left to be reclaimed by the earth. While mapping a newly exposed section of the sheer rock wall that had been washed out by the floods, a surveyor noticed something unnatural protruding from the thick, red mud. It was a heavy, rusted steel door, set flush into the solid limestone. It was an old ventilation shaft, used to pump fresh air down to the miners decades ago. The surveyor climbed down the rocky embankment and brushed the thick mud away from the heavy iron latch. He noticed immediately that it wasn't just stuck shut by rust. Secured tightly around the iron handle was a heavy-duty industrial padlock. It was rusted entirely solid, fused to the metal by decades of rain and snow. It took a specialized blowtorch and nearly an hour of labor to cut the thick steel lock free. When the heavy steel door was finally pulled open, the hinges screaming in protest, a rush of stale, freezing air escaped from the dark, echoing void below. Inside the shaft, at the bottom of a 20-foot sheer drop, lay the remnants of the Blackwood Five. State forensic recovery teams worked for 3 painstaking days under the glare of harsh white floodlights, carefully pulling the remains from the damp, enclosed earth. Dental records and advanced DNA sequencing soon confirmed the inevitable. All 5 victims were there: Thomas, Eleanor, David, Samuel, and Clara. They had finally been found. But the autopsy results brought a wave of absolute nausea to even the most seasoned investigators working the case. There was no blunt force trauma to their skulls. There were no bullet wounds. There were no broken bones indicating a frantic struggle or a violent, bloody end. They had died of exposure and asphyxiation. They had been driven out here in the cold, forced down into the dark, and sealed inside, trapped in the pitch black, in freezing temperatures, waiting for a rescue that would never, ever come. But the most terrifying detail of the entire 35-year mystery wasn't how they died. It was a heavy steel lock on the door. It was locked from the outside. The discovery shifted the cold case into an active, high-priority homicide investigation overnight. Detectives focused entirely on the rusted padlock recovered from the scene. They sent it to a federal metallurgical lab. Advanced cleaning solvents and laser scanning managed to strip away the rust, revealing a faint, stamped serial number on the bottom of the brass casing. It was a commercial lock, specifically the kind issued exclusively to municipal and law enforcement facilities in the county during the 1980s. Cold case investigators descended on the dusty, forgotten basement of the county courthouse. For weeks, they pulled hundreds of 35-year-old handwritten requisition forms from cardboard boxes, searching for a match. Finally, they cross-referenced the serial number with equipment signed out from the supply room in the fall of 1989. The signature on the ledger stopped the lead detective's heart in his chest. Arthur Pendleton. In 1989, Arthur Pendleton was a highly respected senior deputy with the county sheriff's office. He was a pillar of the community. He was a man who had driven the lead cruiser up to the cabin that Monday night. He was a man who had organized the search grids, dictating where the volunteers looked and where the dogs sniffed. He was a man who had hugged Thomas's weeping mother in her living room, looked her in the eye, and promised her he would not rest until he found her son. In 2024, Arthur Pendleton was 72 years old. He lived a quiet, comfortable life in a neat, white-paneled house just 2 miles from the Oakhaven town square. He attended church every Sunday. when a dozen unmarked state police vehicles surrounded his home at dawn, armed tactical teams stacking up on his front porch. The arrest sent a shockwave through a community so violent it left people breathless. The man who had comforted them, the man who had worn a badge and sworn an oath to protect them, was walked out of his home in handcuffs, looking frail and completely unbothered, faced with the undeniable paper trail of the padlock and modern DNA trace evidence found preserved on the inside of the ventilation door. Pendleton's defense completely crumbled. The timeline finally snapped into horrifying, crystal-clear focus. The metallic grille of the vehicle in Eleanor's last, blurry photograph wasn't a poacher's truck. It was a police cruiser. Pendleton had driven his patrol car up to the cabin that Friday night. He had flashed his red and blue lights through the fog. When the group opened the front door, stepping out onto the porch in their socks and indoor clothes, he had likely used his unquestioned authority to tell them there was a massive emergency, a raging forest fire, a toxic chemical spill, an immediate threat to their lives. He ordered them into the back of his enclosed transport vehicle immediately, promising they would only be gone for a moment to evacuate the ridge. They left their coats, their boots, and their rifle behind because they trusted the uniform. They trusted the badge. He drove them directly to the abandoned quarry. He ordered them down into the shaft, likely promising it was a fallout shelter or a safe zone. And then, he closed a heavy steel door, snapped the county-issued padlock shut, and drove away into the fog, leaving them in the dark, faced with a mountain of evidence. Pendleton pleaded guilty to 5 counts of first-degree murder to avoid the death penalty. He sits in a maximum security cell today, a frail old man in a gray jumpsuit, living out the rest of his natural life behind steel bars. But the closure Oakhaven so desperately craved was ultimately hollow, because despite endless hours of intense interrogation by state psychologists and federal profilers, and despite the agonizing, tearful pleas of surviving family members who sat across from him in court, Arthur Pendleton absolutely refused to answer one single question. Why? He had absolutely no prior connection to the victims. There was no evidence of a family feud, no financial motive, no history of violence or previous complaints on his record. He simply looked at the judge with empty, cloudy eyes and accepted his life sentence in total, chilling silence. The families finally have a place to lay their loved ones to rest. The mystery of where the Blackwood Five went has finally been solved. But the dark, suffocating terror of why they were taken remains buried. The town of Oakhaven is quiet again. The cabin is long gone, reclaimed by the forest. The quarry has been permanently sealed with tons of poured concrete. But on nights when the freezing fog rolls down the side of the ridge, settling over the empty roads, the silence feels heavier than it used to. It is the silence of a question that will never, ever be answered. Every case we cover takes time to research because these stories deserve to be remembered. If you want more cases like this, consider subscribing and let me know what case we should cover next.